Hello everyone and welcome back to The Favorite Comics, and in this week's video we are looking at, I would say, the first comic book I fell in love with. That of course is Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon's Preacher. Now Preacher to me is fundamentally everything I like about the Vertigo title. Now I'm probably going to do a video at some point talking about Vertigo and why I love Vertigo so much. I wish DC didn't stop using that title. I wish they would continue to use it. I get why they don't, but I just love Vertigo so much. Preacher to me is a quintessential comic book that I think is one of the earliest examples of what happens when you let a creator do what they want. This book doesn't hold anything back, which is kind of surprising considering who the writer is. Like Garth Ennis, love him or hate him, I for one like him. I don't think all of his work has landed with me the way it has a Preacher, and he can be very over the top, very scary. I think The Boys is a perfect example of that, where it's so much this attack piece of superheroes that it stops being an actual cohesive story. But with Preacher, it feels like Garth actually said, I'm going to tell a good story. I have an idea in my head. It's going to be about Texas. It's going to be about religion. It's going to be against all these things I was told I can't talk about in my comic books. And I'm going to talk about them here because these things matter. That's one of the reasons I love Vertigo, is be able to talk about what you want. That's what Preacher is at its core. It's somebody saying, you think sex and drugs and rock and roll and booze and all of this shit is over the top and crazy? Well, I'm going to write a cohesive comic book that's 66 issues about why that shit's cool. Here's everything you love in a book in one place. You don't have an opinion on God, or you have an opinion on God that's not with the norm of the churches or of like a real group of people, maybe against your parents. You're like, you want to talk about God in a different way? Talk about him here in Preacher. Let me tell you, this book is incredibly well written. And that's saying a lot from Garth Ennis. The guy can write a good story when he wants to, where it's aggressive and mean, but he actually felt like he had something to say here, and I really like that. The characters are all very compelling. We have three main lead characters. Jesse Custer, who I really do enjoy him as the lead. He has this right energy of like being the smartest and most comfortable guy in any room he walks into, but also being like out of his depth in a lot of situations. He is all over the place a lot, and I think that's a really cool element to have in your lead, where he's like, yeah, I can do anything. I love the ability of where he gets his power from. So if any of you don't know, I'm not going to give you too many spoilers on the book of Preacher, but the main crux that gets the book in motion is we follow the adventures of three people. We'll get back to them in a second, but these three people, one of them being the son of a preacher who himself has become a preacher. His name is Jesse Custer. He is going around with his ex-girlfriend and his new friend, and he is granted this power. This like entity called Genesis kind of finds him one day and decides it's going to stay inside him. And through the power of Genesis, Jesse is able to command people to do whatever they want. And that's like kind of the main thing about here is, but the main issue is like Genesis itself is a creation between an angel and a devil. And what happens when those two interact? You get literal hell on earth. It's really intense and a really cool idea for that like storyline. It works so well and it's so cool. Jesse really makes it work. The writing really makes it work. It feels like a story from Texas, which I'm not a big guy who like knows everything about Texas or like the whole cowboy and gunslinger element of that whole state. But I can feel it in here. The way the characters talk, the way they interact, the world around them at large, I think it's really cool in the way they do everything there. A standout to me in this book, and anybody you know who likes comic books and has read this will say a standout, is the character of Cassidy. Cassidy is probably the ultimate sidekick in an adult comic book. I wouldn't say forever because that's obviously Robin, but in a mature setting like this, when you have an actual book that's aimed for a mature audience, you want your side character, you want your sidekick, you want your best friend character to be an over-the-top crazy example of everything you do. Drugs, sex, killing machine, a literal creature of destruction, and it's so well choreographed with every piece of dialogue with that character. You can tell all the weird over-the-top actions that Garth Ennis wants to do, he does with Cassidy, and that's really cool to see. It works so perfectly. It flows so well. The relationship between him and Jesse works great. And then having Tulip in there as the third member of that triangle is so good, because the way that both those men play off that woman It's great writing. There's just a natural conflict and a natural sense of camaraderie between all of them, which is really hard to find in a trio of characters like this. It's just so unique and cool. The story can get a little in over its own head, but it always finds a way to come back out. I think if you are looking for a different type of comic book that there is literally nothing else like, this is a great place to start. I always tell people, Preacher is what happens when you have a good idea and it's executed well. If you're trying to make a statement about God and how, like, none of it matters, this is a great way to do it too. Because the way this story handles the concept of religion, it doesn't do it in a negative way. I mean, you get the sense that Garth and Steve, they're like, well, religion's religion. I don't really care too much for it. But they don't go out of their way to bombast it. There's certain elements about, like, bloodline and lineage and power and God himself being these certain things that it handles fairly maturely, and I really enjoy that too. But on the same note, it's not just about religion. It's about cowboys and gunslingers and this whole world beneath them and the way they travel across the country, going to all these different places. It's amazing. You get some real history in these characters in this world, and it's fantastic. And the Saint of Killers, let me tell you, if you want a great side story for a comic book, the Saint of Killers crushes that role to the extreme. I don't think there's been a better ending for a comic book or a comic book character than how the Saint of Killers ends in this story. Now, I won't get into the spoilers of the book overall. I just want to say, if you ever just take a second to actually read the complete series and you come to the ending, the last thing you're going to feel is disappointed. You're going to be like, wow, that is a great statement being made here in this situation. There's really nothing like it at all. It's such a unique story, and it just goes into every direction you want it to. It can be funny, it can be charming, it could be grotesque and brutal and intense, and you can have nice dramatic moments with the characters about love and loss and conflict and becoming your father and how do you lose your faith in religion. Were you ever religious at all? All like pasted beautifully with Steve Dillon's gorgeous artwork. Like, it's so gorgeous to see the way these characters are drawn, because when they need to be gross and creepy, they are gross and creepy. When they need to be sexual, they are sexual. It blends so perfectly into a great narrative, and everything about it works to the extreme. That's so nice to see from a comic book like this. I remember when the TV show came out, and I was kind of disappointed in the TV show just because it didn't capture that right energy that the book went for. And you could tell that Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg loved this book. They really understood what I was trying to be, but that's hard to translate into screen because there's something so poignant about what it's trying to say in that book that's really hard to capture in a different setting. I think it works perfectly. There's some really great villains in here. Like I said, Saint of Killers is great. Hairstar, absolutely a great villain. I would argue one of the best in Vertigo history. There's just the way he acts. It's just such a subtlety to how he does every little action as compared to the over-the-top characters. And that works perfectly in this world. It's just so beautiful and intense. And this book, I don't understand why this one isn't celebrated as much as it should be. People like it. I get how some people could be afraid of like the hardcore nature of it. But to me, it's like, it's exactly what I said about Sex Criminals, where if you're going to make a book about sex, talk about sex openly and in a mature way that doesn't pander to the audience. If you're going to talk about the importance of God and heaven and hell and how all this stuff maybe matters or maybe it doesn't matter, don't pander to your audience. You go all out with it. You say the things that are probably true in the real world if those things actually did happen or they didn't. That's what you should do here. You got this idea of a power of literally controlling people. Use it to do some bizarre shit that will never end. And there's some great stuff here. I do want to bring up one really cool moment from the book that I think if you haven't really got into this series, I think this is a moment that's going to make you really understand what this book is trying to say. So when Jesse Custer does have this power, he tells this one FBI agent, he's like, why don't you go to this beach and count every single grain of sand? And we see that in one of the earliest issues of the book. We follow that up later where the guy's been there for months counting each individual piece of sand, and he has to start over because he messed up in like the millions. That is such a cool thing to see. It's such a unique story, and you can actually tell that Garth Ennis cared about this one. And I'm not saying he didn't care about his other works, but this one was just so true to being this hardcore rock and roll punk thing that it captured that world perfectly, it captured that essence perfectly, and there's really nothing else like it. I love Vertigo. I think that line and that publishing idea was really important, and Preacher was one of the staples of that line to me. It won't be the last Vertigo book we talk about, but it's the first one that really made me go, like, this is something important, and Preacher itself was one of those first books I read when I was starting to come into my own and understand story in a more mature setting that made me go, this is a really cool idea about love and friendship and religion that we don't explore that much in other mediums, because if we try to go this hardcore, it doesn't work as well as other stuff. I wish it did, but it seriously hasn't, and I want more stuff like Preacher to exist, but the fact that we got 66 issues of a consistent story from Garth Ennis that has an ending, that has severely good character moments, that understands Jesse Custer and Cassidy and Tulip in such a great and powerful way, is literally amazing that we actually got there as a society. I don't know why I said as a society, but you guys know what I mean. So there are 6 big volumes of Preacher you can buy. They've been publishing them forever. I highly recommend you go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books. Go pick them up and read a really interesting story that's very mature, very dark, but actually has a concise ending that's going to make you think about the world in a different way. So that is why Preacher is one of my favorite comics. Now, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening to this on the podcast feed, be sure to give us a rating there, because I'm always curious to see how the numbers do on that. As always, you can check me out on Instagram, Patreon, Twitter, all that good stuff. And as always, I will catch you in the next one. Have fun. Stay safe. Good luck. Tsunami Studios.